Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. I shall continue my series about international relations between the world wars for GCSE History. In this video, I'm going to assess the League of Nations. So, the League of Nations was effectively at an end in 1939 with the outbreak of the Second World War, although the organisation wasn't formally dissolved until 1946. I have adumbrated incidents which undermined the League of Nations in previous videos. The principle of collective security was a dead letter by then. The idea of collective security was that if there's a bully, all the small countries will band together and thump him, something like that. But it didn't work out because people were not willing to fight when it wasn't in their national interest. They hoped that they could just ignore acts of aggression. Now, no country was entirely innocent. Some people in the United Kingdom saying, well, why are we complaining about the Third Reich annexing other countries because we've annexed other countries in the past? And why are we complaining about Italy invading Abyssinia, it's now called Ethiopia, because we invaded other countries? And Churchill said, well, that was the 19th century, and the 20th century times have changed. Anyway, the United States was not a member of the League of Nations, and that was a crucial weakness. There were other difficulties, such as the Central Powers countries not being members in the early 1920s, and then never confiding trusting as a fair organisation. The Soviet Union wasn't a member until 1934. Even if the United States had joined in 1919, it's probable that the United States would have reverted to an isolationist stance in the wake of the Great Depression, which began in 1929. Because the United States is the linchpin of NATO these days, it's hard to remember that until the 1940s, the United States stood aloof from international alliances, believed in the Monroe Principle, that the United States should dominate the American continent, not just its own land, but the Caribbean islands, various countries in South America. But the United States should not get involved in other continents, not in Europe, Asia, Africa, and that the United States should prevent other countries having any political control of the American continent, as in countries in Latin America, Caribbean islands. Well, let's move on to a conclusion about the League of Nations. So it enjoyed some notable successes in the early days, in the 1920s, when there was an appetite for peace and there was a lot of optimism. But by the 1930s, its failures became more apparent and they overshadowed its successes. This led to the eventual demise of the League of Nations. The League was flawed from its very inception, but it did manage to survive. The consequences of the Wall Street crash spelt doom for the League of Nations. Countries turned inwards and became a bit more chauvinistic. What else? So it was almost bound to fail after 1929. The League of Nations had a new lease of life in the 20s due to the Dawes Plan, the Locarno Pact, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Things seemed to be going its way. But some of these countries had no intention of honouring the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Japanese and the Italians were already planning to attack their neighbours whilst they signed that. And in such an atmosphere, it was only a matter of time before the League of Nations was a farce. Anyway, it was supposed to be a peacekeeping organisation. We can look at some turning points. Number one, the Polish occupation of Vilna, we call it Vilnius, which I've already mentioned, the largest city in Lithuania, but over 90% of its inhabitants were ethnically Polish. It had once been united with Poland way back in the 17th century, but it was indubitably a breach of international law. That was certainly Lithuanian sovereign territory, but France protected her protégé, Poland, from even censure. All right, the Wall Street crash of 1928-9 had grave repercussions, as previously outlined. And this brought to office governments in Germany and other countries that were bitterly opposed to the namby-pamby League of Nations as they saw it. And they felt nothing but contempt towards League of Nations ideals. The League of Nations then gravitated towards appeasement. But it took some time before it was blatant that anti-League of Nations spirit was predominant. Countries were less able to pay their dues to the League of Nations because it had to be financed by its member states paying for it. Economic nationalism led to a decline in this brotherhood of man ideal and international cooperation and commerce. Poverty and desperation made people fall prey to these silver-tongued politicians and totalitarian ideologies. Another step in the League of Nations' sad degeneration, that be 1931, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, province of China. The League of Nations took no significant action. The Japanese claimed that a railway at Mukden that they controlled had been blown up by Chinese troops. Years later, it emerged that Japanese soldiers had deliberately blown it up themselves, under orders from their own government, in order to create a pretext. This is their casus belli, is a false flag operation, blowing up their own railway so they could blame the Chinese. But the League of Nations did not take proper action against this naked act of aggression. The Lytton Commission, it took a year to report. And people knew the League of Nations was a lumbering organisation, was a mealy-mouthed one, and wouldn't take firm action. And therefore, an aggressor who would act rapidly and decisively could go right ahead and do things, and it would be too late to stop them. It would require far too much willpower to reverse an annexation once it had been completed. So the Wall Street crash was bad news for every country, and they suffered because international trade was reduced, unemployment increased massively, financial links were severed. The Dawes Plan had done so much for Germany and the rest of the world economy from 1924, with America lending so much money to Germany, it kick-started the German economy. But anyway, the Young Plan extended that, and then 1929, the Young Plan was all over. The US refused to extend its loans. So Germany had much less money to lend. It couldn't pay back reparations to France and the UK. The French and British groaned about this, but the Germans were still committed to the principle of paying it off when they could. When Hitler came to office in 1933, he announced that he would never pay the Western Allies another pfennig. And the Western Allies moaned about it, but again, they took no action. So trading links, as I say, people putting up tariff barriers in the 1930s, such as we see today that President Trump wants to do. So taxing imports encourage your citizens to buy products from your country. The trouble is your neighbours will also erect tariff barriers, which makes it more difficult for you to sell your goods abroad because there's such a high tax. And the countries have become protectionist, protecting their own economies from competition. And it actually ended up costing jobs in every country. This is economic nationalism. There was a clamour for the government to do something, even though their so-called solution was in fact exacerbating the situation. This downturn in world trade led to mass unemployment, despair, and people being susceptible to demagogues. The Japanese economy was very export-based, and so the depression hit Japan very severely.